That cold morning, no one expected an act of kindness to change everything. What started as another day on the road became a story the whole town tried to explain, and few had the courage to tell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here, we show that behind the engines and the leather, there are still human hearts. The rain came down in sheets, turning the cracked asphalt of Highway 17 into a slick mirror that reflected the gray sky above. Jax Harlan gripped the handlebars of his Harley, the engine's low rumble vibrating through his bones like an old ache he couldn't shake. He rode point for the Iron Riders, a tight-knit crew of wanderers who'd claimed this stretch of forgotten road as their own. The air smelled of wet earth and diesel, sharp enough to cut through the fog of another sleepless night. At 42, Jax had seen enough miles to know that trouble didn't announce itself with fanfare. It just pulled up beside you, uninvited. Behind him, the pack thundered in formation, 6 bikes, leather-clad shadows cutting through the downpour. There was Mick, the grizzled veteran with scars from Nam etched into his knuckles. Lena, the only woman in the group, her eyes sharp as switchblades, from years nursing bar fights and broken dreams. And the others, Rico, Tate, and Ben, who followed Jax not out of fear, but because he'd pulled each of them from the edge when the world had written them off. They weren't outlaws in the movies, all flash and fury. No, the Iron Riders were survivors, patched together from the scraps of lives society had discarded. Mechanics by trade, guardians by choice. They fixed what was broken, on the road or off it. Up ahead, taillights flickered like a dying ember through the rain. A sleek black Mercedes had veered off the shoulder, its hood popped open, steam hissing from the engine like a wounded animal. Jax signaled with a gloved fist, and the pack slowed, engines growling down to a murmur. He killed his bike first, boots hitting the mud with a soft suck. The others fanned out, forming a loose circle around the stranded car, not aggressive, just present. Rain dripped from Jax's beard, soaking into the collar of his faded Iron Rider's vest. He wiped his face with a scarred hand, eyes narrowing at the figure emerging from the driver's side. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored wool coat that screamed money, the kind that bought silence and second chances. His hair was silver at the temples, face lined with the wear of boardrooms and bad decisions. He clutched a leather briefcase like a shield, water beating on its polished surface. No tie, though. The top button of his shirt was undone, revealing a glimpse of vulnerability beneath the polish. He looked out of place here, like a wolf in a den of lions, but his eyes, dark, steady, held no panic, just calculation. "Need a hand?" Jax called over the patter of rain, his voice gravelly from years of shouting over engines and regrets. He stepped closer, boots crunching gravel, keeping his posture open. The Iron Riders had a reputation in these parts, whispers of rough justice, of standing up when the law turned a blind eye. Folks crossed the street when they rolled into town, assuming the worst. But Jax knew better. Assumptions were what got people hurt. The man straightened, rain sluicing down his face. He didn't flinch at the sight of the bikers, didn't reach for a phone or a weapon. Instead, he met Jax's gaze, something unreadable flickering in his expression. "Yeah," he said, voice smooth, edged with an accent that hinted at East Coast power. "Radiator blew. Cell signal's dead out here. You folks know anything about cars?" Mick chuckled from behind, low and rumbling. "We know a thing or two." He dismounted, toolbox in hand, while Lena hung back, arms crossed, watching the stranger like she was sizing up a storm cloud. The man nodded, stepping aside as Mick popped the hood higher, peering into the guts of the machine. Tools clinked, rain hissed on hot metal. Jax stayed put, studying the driver. There was a tension in the man's shoulders, not from the breakdown, but something deeper, a weight that pulled at him like an anchor. Minutes ticked by in the downpour. The others kept watch, eyes scanning the empty road, hands near their belts out of habit. Finally, the man broke the silence. "You ride with the Iron Riders, right? Heard about you in Reno. They say you're dangerous." His words hung there, casual, but his eyes locked on Jax's, searching. Jax felt a familiar stir in his chest, the old defensiveness, the isolation that came with leather and rumors. He'd lost count of the times he'd been judged by his vest, his bike, the ink on his arms. A father once, before the war took his legs, and his family took his name. Now, just the road and the brothers who understood silence better than words. He shrugged, water dripping from his lashes. "Depends on who's asking. We fix what's broke, protect what's ours." The man tilted his head, rain tracing lines down his cheek like tears he wouldn't shed. He set the briefcase on the wet trunk, fingers lingering on the latch as if debating a confession. Then, unexpectedly, he turned fully to Jax, voice dropping low against the storm. "Do you think I'm dangerous?" The question landed like a punch Jax hadn't seen coming. He blinked, the world narrowing to the man's face, etched with lines that spoke of empires built and secrets buried. Why ask that? Why now, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by men the world called threats? Jax's hand tightened on his handlebars, the leather creaking. He'd seen danger in boardrooms, in the cold eyes of men who hid behind suits. But this felt like a crack in armor, a plea wrapped in pride. Before Jax could respond, Mick straightened from the engine, wiping grease on his jeans. "She's patched for now. Get you to the next town, but it'll cost you." His tone was light, but his eyes flicked to Jax, sensing the shift. The man nodded, pulling out a wallet thick as a novel. As he handed over the cash, his gaze never left Jax's. Waiting. The rain eased to a drizzle, the air heavy with the scent of oil and possibility. Jax mounted his bike, engine coughing to life. But that question echoed in his mind, stirring something long buried, a moral pull, the first thread of a choice that would unravel everything. Who was this stranger, really? And why did his words feel like a mirror, reflecting back the doubts Jax carried alone? The pack revved up, ready to ride, but Jax lingered a beat longer, the road ahead blurring into uncertainty. The drizzle hung in the air like a veil, softening the edges of the world as the Iron Riders pulled away from the Mercedes. Jax twisted the throttle, the Harley's growl cutting through the quiet. But his mind snagged on that question, looping like a bad gear. "Do you think I'm dangerous?" The stranger's voice had been steady, almost too steady, as if he'd rehearsed it in the rearview mirror during the drive. Jax glanced back once, seeing the man slide into the driver's seat, the car coughing to life with a reluctant sputter. Taillights faded into the mist, swallowed by the highway's curve. Back at the garage on the outskirts of Willow Creek, a rusting relic of a town where the main street ended in a chain-link fence, the pack dispersed like smoke. The Iron Riders' base was no fortress, just a squat cinderblock building with oil stains blooming across the concrete floor like old bruises. Overhead, fluorescents buzzed faintly, casting long shadows over workbenches cluttered with wrenches, half-rebuilt carbs, and the faint scent of stale coffee mingling with motor oil. Jax killed his engine outside, the sudden silence pressing in, broken only by the distant hum of a semi on the interstate. He pushed through the side door, boots echoing on the gritty floor. Mick was already at the workbench, wiping down tools with a rag that had seen better days. "That suit had eyes like a hawk circling roadkill," Mick said, not looking up. His voice carried the weight of decades. Vietnam flashbacks that woke him in sweats. A daughter he hadn't seen since she was 10. Mick fixed engines because they didn't judge, didn't leave. Jax nodded, peeling off his wet vest and hanging it on a hook by the heater. The warmth hit his skin, chasing the chill, but it did nothing for the knot in his gut. Lena leaned against the far wall, arms crossed over her faded flannel, her dark hair tied back in a practical knot. She'd joined the Riders 5 years back, after her ex put her in the hospital with a busted jaw and a promise of worse. Now, she handled the books and the bar runs, her laugh rare but real when it came. "He didn't look scared," she observed, eyes flicking to Jack's. "Most suits bolt at the sight of us. That one? He sized us up like we were the help." She poured coffee from a dented percolator, the steam rising in lazy curls, and slid a mug his way. Jax took it, the ceramic hot against his palms, grounding him. The others filtered in. Rico with his easy grin, fresh from a smoke break. Tate, quiet as ever, nursing a knee from an old crash. Ben, the youngest at 28, still carrying the wide-eyed hunger of a kid who'd lost his mom to cancer and his way to the bottle. They gathered around the scarred wooden table in the corner, the one they'd dragged in from a diner closing sale. No formal meetings, just the ritual of unwinding. Stories swapped low, beers cracked if the day warranted it. Today, it did. Jack sat heavy in his chair, the wood creaking under him, and recounted the breakdown, the fix, the question. The words felt thick on his tongue, like admitting a weakness. "Do you think I'm dangerous?" Rico echoed, chuckling into his bottle. But there was no mirth in it. Just the echo of their shared history. Nights in Reno when the law had rolled up, assuming theft from the bikes parked outside a dive bar. Cuffs ready before questions. They'd been cleared, of course. Just grabbing a meal after a long haul. But the stares lingered. The whispers in town. Thugs, drifters, trouble on 2 wheels. Jax had felt it his whole life, since the army discharged him with a purple heart and a limp that ached in the rain. His ex had taken the kids, said he was too broken for family. The Riders had become that family, stitched from loyalty and the unspoken code: ride for your own, protect the overlooked. "He wasn't asking about us," Jack said finally, staring into his coffee. The black surface rippled with his breath, reflecting fragments of the fluorescent light. It was personal, like he was testing the water. He thought of the man's hands, manicured but calloused at the edges, the kind from gripping steering wheels in tense negotiations, not handlebars. The briefcase, too polished, too important. Who was he? Some exec fleeing a deal gone south? Or something heavier, like the shadows Jack saw in his own mirror some mornings? Outside, the rain picked up again, drumming on the tin roof like impatient fingers. Lena set down her mug, the clink sharp in the quiet. "World sees us as monsters, Jax. Maybe he sees himself the same." Her words hung there, stirring the air. She'd said it before, after pulling a waitress from a grabby patron at the roadside joint down the way. The girl had trembled, whispering thanks, but the cops had eyed Lena like she was the instigator. Assumptions. They cut deeper than knives. Mick grunted, polishing a spark plug with deliberate strokes. "We ain't saints, but we ain't the devil neither." Fixed his ride, took his cash. End of story. But Jax knew it wasn't. That question had cracked something open, a moral itch he couldn't scratch. He'd answered with silence then, riding away, but now it gnawed. What if the man was running from real danger? Not a breakdown, but something human, fragile. The Riders had stood for the week before. The single mom whose truck died outside town, the vet hitchhiking with ghosts in his eyes. Small acts, quiet justice. As the evening deepened, the garage lights dimmed to save power, the group thinning out to their bunks in the back room or the motel across the lot. Jack stayed, alone with the hum of the fridge and the patter of rain. He traced a finger over an old tattoo on his forearm, a hawk in flight, inked after his discharge. Strength or cage? The stranger's face resurfaced, that steady gaze piercing the storm. Dangerous. The word tasted like regret. Jack stood, grabbing his jacket, the leather cool and familiar. Tomorrow he'd ride the highway again, but tonight Doubt rode with him. A silent companion, whispering of choices yet to come. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, each second a small judgment. In the margins of the world, where engines cooled and hearts hardened, Jax wondered if kindness was the real risk. The road waited, endless and unforgiving, but for the first time in years, he felt the pull of something beyond it. A thread of compassion, fragile as mist, leading into the unknown. The sun clawed its way over the horizon the next morning, painting the garage in rusty hues that seeped through the grimy windows like blood from an old wound. Jack stirred on the cot in the back room, the thin blanket tangled around his legs, his dreams fragmented by echoes of that question. He sat up slowly, the ache in his knee flaring, a souvenir from a roadside skirmish years back, when he'd pulled a kid from a wrecked pickup while the sheriff watched from afar, doing nothing. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp concrete and yesterday's rain, the kind that lingered like unspoken regrets. He rubbed his face, stubble rough under his palms, and glanced at the clock. 6:47. Another day on the edge. Outside, the world was stirring. Trucks rumbled past on the highway, their horns faint warnings in the distance. Jax pulled on his boots, the leather creaking like a confession, and stepped into the main bay. The garage was empty, the others off on early runs, Mick to the scrapyard for parts, Lena handling a tow call from the diner. Solitude suited him, gave space for the thoughts that crowded in like uninvited riders. He brewed coffee in the percolator, the gurgle and hiss filling the quiet, steam rising like ghosts from the pot. As he sipped, black and bitter, his eyes drifted to the workbench where Mick had left the stranger's payment. A crisp 100, more than the fix was worth. Folded neatly, almost apologetic. He pocketed it, but the gesture felt off, like carrying someone else's burden. Who was the man? Jax had seen his type before. Suits with eyes that darted like cornered animals, hiding empires or ruins. The question replayed. Do you think I'm dangerous? It wasn't fear in the man's voice. It was invitation, a crack in the facade begging to be widened. Jack set the mug down, the porcelain clinking softly, and grabbed his keys. The road called, but today it pulled him toward Willow Creek, the nearest speck of civilization, a cluster of faded storefronts and a gas station where gossip flowed freer than the pumps. The Harley purred to life under him, tires biting into the gravel as he rode out. The morning air nipped at his skin, carrying the faint tang of pine from the hills beyond. Willow Creek unfolded slowly. The post office with its peeling paint, the hardware store where old-timers nursed stools and swapped lies, the diner with its neon sign flickering even in daylight, Eats in red cursive that promised more than it delivered. Jax parked outside the ladder, the engine's rumble fading to a sigh. He didn't come for food, not really. It was the pulse of the town he sought, the undercurrent of stories that bikes and leather couldn't touch. Inside, the diner smelled of grease and fresh pie, the sizzle of bacon on the grill a steady heartbeat. A few locals hunched over counters, farmers with calloused hands, a waitress named Ellie wiping down booths with a rag that had seen too many spills. She was in her late 30s, lines around her eyes from double shifts, and a husband who drank more than he worked. Jax nodded to her as he slid onto a stool, the vinyl creaking under his weight. "Coffee black," he said, voice low. She poured without a word, her hand steady, but her gaze lingering a beat too long, the mix of wariness and warmth that came with knowing the rider's reputation. As she moved away, conversations hummed around him. Truckers griping about fuel prices, a couple of kids in the corner booth whispering over homework. But then, a voice cut through, gravelly and familiar. Harlan Tate, no relation but close enough in the rider's loose family. Tate was nursing a plate of eggs at the end of the counter, his knee braced under the stool from that old crash. "Heard about your roadside Samaritan yesterday," Tate said, fork pausing midair. His eyes, sharp despite the limp, met Jax's. That Mercedes belongs to some big-shot CEO out of San Fran, Elias Crow, runs a tech empire, phones, apps, the works. Word is, he's in town for a buyout, shaking hands with the mill owners up the ridge. Jax's grip tightened on the mug, the heat seeping through. Crow. The name rang faint bells, headlines blurred by time, something about ruthless deals and a personal life shrouded in silence. What else? He asked, keeping his tone even, though his pulse quickened like an engine revving. Tate shrugged, scraping the last of his eggs. Rumor mill says he's not just buying land. Got enemies trailing him, corporate sharks, maybe worse. Pulled up yesterday looking spooked, like the devil was in his rear view. Folks here think he's slumming it, but Ellie... He nodded toward the waitress, who was refilling sugars with deliberate care. She served him last night. Said he sat alone, staring at nothing, then asked about people who ride free. Sound like your suit? Ellie approached then, sensing the shift, her apron dusted with flour. She leaned in, voice a hushed murmur over the clatter of dishes. He tipped big, Jax. Left a note with the bill. Thanks for the fix. Roads like these make a man think. Didn't say much else, but his hands. They shook when he signed, like he was carrying the world. Her eyes softened, a flicker of compassion breaking through the fatigue. She'd been there herself once, after her sister vanished, leaving her to raise 2 kids alone. The riders had towed her car for free that winter, no questions. Small debts, paid in quiet. Jax felt the knot in his chest tighten, a moral pull he couldn't ignore. Dangerous? Crow had asked it like a mirror, reflecting Jax's own shadows. The isolation of a man judged by his scars, the guilt of a father who'd faded from his daughters' lives. He thought of the war, the buddies lost to sand and silence, the discharge papers that branded him unfit. The riders had given him purpose, fixing the broken, standing for the forgotten. But this? Helping a man who could buy the town twice over felt like stepping into deeper water, where loyalty blurred with risk. He paid for the coffee, leaving extra on the counter, and stepped back into the light. The sun beat down now, warming the asphalt, but the air hummed with tension. As he mounted the bike, engine growling awake, a black sedan idled at the curb across the street, sleek, anonymous, windows tinted like secrets. It didn't move, just watched. Jax's hand hovered near the throttle, instinct prickling his skin. Coincidence? Or the first thread of something unraveling? He rode back to the garage, the wind whipping at his face, carrying whispers of confrontation. The question echoed louder now, not just Crow's, but his own. What made a man dangerous? The leather he wore, or the empire he built on others' backs? The road stretched ahead, but for the first time, Jax felt the weight of a choice pressing in, compassion stirring against the isolation he'd armored himself with. The pack would need to know. Decisions like this rode on brotherhood. Back at the garage, as the afternoon shadows lengthened, Jax gathered the tools for a routine check, but his mind raced. Crow wasn't just a suit, he was a storm brewing, and Jax, against every guarded instinct, felt drawn into it. A quiet justice waiting to unfold. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of courage and loyalty can travel. The afternoon sun slanted through the garage windows, casting elongated shadows that danced like uneasy specters across the oil-slicked floor. Jax stood by the open bay door, arms crossed over his chest, the faint whine of a distant chainsaw from the lumber mill up the ridge cutting through the heavy air. His knee throbbed faintly, a reminder of old battles, but it was the black sedan's image that lingered sharper than any pain. Tinted windows staring back like unblinking eyes. He'd ridden straight back after spotting it, the wind doing little to clear the fog of suspicion settling in his mind. Crow wasn't just broken down. He was hunted, and that question, Do you think I'm dangerous? Now felt like a lure, pulling Jax toward waters he hadn't tested in years. He turned as the rumble of engines announced the pack's return. Mick pulled in first, his truck loaded with salvaged parts that clattered like loose change in a beggar's pocket. Lena followed on her own bike, a battered Softail that she'd rebuilt herself after her ex torched the original in a fit of rage. The others trailed in, faces etched with the day's wear, Rico wiping sweat from his brow, Tate limping slightly as he dismounted, Ben carrying a crate of filters with the quiet focus of someone still proving his place. They sensed Jax's tension immediately, the way his jaw set like concrete under strain, his gaze fixed on the empty highway beyond. "Spill it," Lena said, killing her engine and swinging a leg over. She leaned against the workbench, her flannel shirt rolled to the elbows, revealing faded tattoos of roses and thorns, symbols of beauty guarded by pain. Jax recounted the diner talk. Elias Crow, the tech mogul with enemies in his shadow. The note left with Ellie, the sedan that idled like a predator. He kept his voice steady, but his hands betrayed him, fingers drumming a slow rhythm on his thigh, the leather of his glove creaking softly. Mick set down a wrench with a deliberate clank, his scarred knuckles whitening. CEOs like that don't break down on back roads by accident. He's running from something. Boardroom coup, maybe blackmail. We fix bikes, not messes like this. But his eyes, shadowed by years of watching friends fade into VA waiting rooms, held a flicker of reluctance. Mick had lost a brother to corporate greed once, a factory shutdown that left him penniless and raging. The riders had pulled him from the bottle then, their loyalty a lifeline in the silence of judgment. Rico paced, his easy grin absent, replaced by a furrowed brow that aged him beyond his 35 years. "We walk away, Jax. Worlds full of suits drowning in their own ink. Why us?" Ben nodded beside him, young enough to still chase the illusion of clean lines between right and wrong, but old enough to know the road blurred them. Tate stayed silent, rubbing his knee, his stare distant as if replaying the crash that nearly took his leg. A semi-driver on his phone, the law calling it an act of God instead of negligence. Jax felt the weight of their eyes, the Brotherhood's unspoken code pressing in like the humid air before a storm. Isolation had been his armor for so long, a solitary ride through regrets. The daughters he hadn't seen since they were toddlers, their mother's voice echoing in court. He's not safe. The war had stripped him bare, leaving scars that society read as threats. But the riders had taught him otherwise. Strength wasn't in solitude, it was in the quiet stand, the hand extended when no one else would. Crow's question had pierced that armor, mirroring his own doubts. Dangerous. Jax had asked himself the same in the mirror after every bar fight diffused, every tow for a stranded soul. "I can't shake it," Jax admitted, his voice dropping to a gravel whisper, the words tasting like admission. He stepped toward the fridge, pulling out cold bottles that sweated in the heat, handing them out like offerings. The fizz of caps popping filled the pause, a small ritual of unity. He looked at me like he saw through the leather. Asked if I thought he was dangerous, like he needed to hear it from someone who knows what that word really means. Lena took her beer, her fingers brushing his in a gesture of solidarity, her eyes softening with the empathy of shared exile. She'd been judged too, woman in a man's world, patched into the vest but forever proving her grit. The group settled around the table, the wood scarred from countless maps sketched in grease. Outside, thunder rumbled low, the sky bruising purple as rain threatened again. Jax traced the grain of the table, memories surfacing unbidden. The night he'd found Lena bleeding in a Reno alley, her ex's threats hanging like smoke. They'd ridden her to safety, no questions, just the hum of engines carrying her through. Compassion wasn't weakness. It was the fire that kept the cold at bay. "If he's in trouble," Jax continued, meeting each gaze, "and we turn blind, what does that make us? The world's already written us off as heartless. Maybe this is our chance to prove 'em wrong. Tension coiled in the air, thick as the scent of impending rain. Mick leaned back, chair groaning, his face a map of conflict, loyalty warring with caution. Risky, brother. His world's got lawyers and guns we don't. But there was no outright refusal. The writer's code pulsed beneath, a moral compass forged in the margins. Tate finally spoke, voice rough as sandpaper. Saw that sedan too, circling the mill road earlier. If it's tailing him, it might loop back here. The words landed heavy, stirring the group into motion. Rico checking locks, Ben scanning the perimeter through the window, his breath fogging the glass. As dusk crept in, the first drops pattered on the roof, a steady rhythm that mirrored Jax's heartbeat. He stepped outside alone, the cool mist kissing his face, and lit a cigarette, the flame flickering against the wind. The highway stretched dark and endless, taillights winking in the distance like hesitant signals. Crow's face resurfaced, the silver at his temples, the steady gaze hiding tremors in his hands. What burdens did a man like that carry? Empires built on code and contracts, perhaps crumbling under the weight of betrayal. Jax exhaled smoke, watching it dissolve into the rain, feeling the shift within. Isolation cracking, compassion seeping through like light under a door. Back inside, the pack gathered closer, voices low as they pieced together a plan, not aggressive, but watchful. Ride the ridge tomorrow, eyes open for the sedan, a quiet patrol born of brotherhood. No oaths sworn, just nods exchanged, the kind that bound deeper than words. Jax felt the evolution stir, a slow burn from guarded loner to reluctant guardian. The rain intensified, drumming a somber cadence, washing the world clean but stirring the mud of moral choice. Dangerous? The real peril lay in doing nothing, in letting the world's judgments define them. As night fell, the garage lights glowed like a beacon in the storm. The Iron Riders united not by fury, but by the fragile thread of humanity they refused to let snap. The thunder rolled closer, a warning of tempests yet to break, and Jax wondered if redemption waited on the other side. Of the road, of the rain, of the man who dared to ask. The rain hammered the garage roof like a relentless interrogation, each drop a question Jax couldn't answer. He stood in the doorway, cigarette forgotten between his fingers, the ember glowing faintly against the encroaching night. The pack's murmurs faded behind him, replaced by the storm's symphony, wind whipping through the pines, thunder cracking like a judge's gavel. Jax crushed the butt under his boot, the spark dying in a hiss, and turned back inside. The air inside felt thicker now, charged with the weight of their half-formed plan. Watchful eyes on the ridge, a loose patrol under the guise of a parts run. It wasn't a declaration of war, it was the rider's way, quiet vigilance, born from too many times when silence had cost more than words. Mick was at the map table, sketching routes with a grease pencil, his broad shoulders hunched like a man bracing for impact. "We stick to the back trails," he said, voice low and measured, the lines around his eyes deepening in the dim light. "No heroics, just eyes." Lena nodded, coiling a length of chain into her saddlebag, her movements precise, almost tender, as if handling a fragile promise. She'd lost too much to impulse. Her scars ran deeper than skin, hidden under layers of resolve. Rico and Ben hovered nearby, cleaning side mirrors with rags that smelled of solvent and sweat, their banter subdued, laced with the undercurrent of shared doubt. Tate sat apart, polishing his boot knife with slow, rhythmic strokes, the blade catching glints from the overhead bulb like a fleeting truth. Jax felt the pull of it all, the Brotherhood's gravity drawing him from the isolation he'd clung to like a second skin. He poured another round of coffee, the steam curling up like unspoken fears, and handed mugs around. The ceramic warmed his palms, a small anchor in the swirl. Crow's note to Ellie, he said, breaking the quiet. Roads like these make a man think. Sounds like he's unraveling. The words hung there, stirring memories of his own unraveling. The night after the divorce, when he'd ridden until dawn, the engine's roar drowning the echo of his youngest daughter's cry. Dangerous. He'd been that once, rage-fueled and reckless, until the riders pulled him back, their loyalty a balm on wounds too raw for words. Lena sipped her coffee, her gaze steady on Jack's. Thinking's what gets us in deep. But ignoring it, that's what lets the wolves win. Her voice carried the weight of her past, the ex who'd left her for dead in that alley, the cops who'd dismissed her as trouble because of her ink and attitude. The riders had been her justice then, a circle of leather and resolve that society overlooked. Now, with Crow, it felt like history echoing, a man on the margins of his own world, judged by his power rather than his pain. The storm peaked as they talked, lightning fracturing the sky outside, illuminating the garage in stark flashes that etched their faces in silver and shadow. Ben, the youngest, shifted uneasily, his fingers tracing the edge of his vest patch. A phoenix rising from flames, inked after his mother's funeral. What if the sedan's not after him? What if it's after us, just for sticking our necks out? His question was raw, the tremor in his voice betraying the boy beneath the beard, the one who'd joined to escape the bottle's grip. Jax met his eyes, seeing his own younger self reflected there, wide with the fear of being written off forever. "We ride together," Jax replied, his tone firm but laced with the quiet compassion that had bound them. "That's the code. No one's left exposed." It was more than words. It was the evolution stirring in him, the slow thaw from solitary rider to something more. A guardian, perhaps, forged in the fire of shared scars. The war had taught him isolation's cost, buddies lost to the desert's indifference. The riders had mended that fracture, piece by quiet piece. Now, Crow's plea, disguised as a question, tugged at the same thread, urging him toward a moral crossroads. Turn away and preserve the fragile peace, or step in and risk the storm. As the rain eased to a steady patter, they mounted up, engines coughing to life in the night. The pack rolled out in loose formation, headlights cutting through the mist like hesitant beacons. Jax took point, the Harley vibrating under him, the road slick and unforgiving. They veered onto the ridge trail, a winding scar through the hills where the mill's lights flickered like distant campfires. The air smelled of wet pine and ozone, sharp enough to clear the mind. But Jax's thoughts raced ahead. Crow's face haunted him, the steady gaze cracking at the edges, hands trembling over that briefcase. What secrets did it hold? Contracts stained with ambition, or something human, like a letter from a life left behind. Miles blurred under the tires, the pack's engines a low chorus against the night's hush. Then, a glint ahead. Taillights, low and predatory, weaving through the curves. The black sedan, unmistakable in the moonlight's sheen. Jax signaled, fist raised, and they slowed, fanning out like shadows merging with the trees. Heart pounding, he killed his lights, the sudden darkness pressing in. The sedan idled at a pullout, its engine a faint purr, doors sealed tight. No movement, just waiting, like a trap sprung silent. Adrenaline surged, but Jax held, hand raised to steady the others. Mick's bike idled beside him, the veteran's breath steady despite the tension. "Could be nothing," Mick murmured, but his knuckles whitened on the grips. Lena edged closer, her eyes scanning the underbrush, every sense attuned to the unseen threats she'd outrun before. The moral weight settled heavier now. Intervene. And they stepped into Crow's world of shadows. Ignore it. And the question of danger lingered unanswered, a guilt that corroded from within. A door clicked open on the sedan, the sound sharp as a snapped branch. A figure emerged, tall, coat flapping in the wind. Not Crow, but someone leaner, purposeful. He scanned the darkness, phone to his ear, voice lost to the distance, but the posture screaming urgency. Jax's breath caught, the scene unfolding like a half-remembered nightmare. Was this pursuit or protection? The man paused, as if sensing eyes on him, then slid back inside, the car lurching forward with a spray of gravel. The pack held position until the taillights vanished, the road swallowing them whole. Jax exhaled slowly, the tremor in his hands betraying the calm he projected. "Follow at a distance," he decided, voice a gravel whisper. The engines revved low, the chase beginning not with fury, but with the quiet resolve of men who'd learned that true danger hid in the spaces between choices. As they rode into the night, the ridge rising like a judgment, Jax felt the shift deepen. Compassion no longer a flicker, but a flame, illuminating the path to whatever redemption awaited in the storm's wake. Thunder grumbled farewell in the distance, the rain a soft veil now, as the iron riders pressed on, bound by loyalty's unyielding hum. The night air sliced through Jax's jacket like a whispered accusation, the ridge trail twisting under the Harley's tires in a serpentine dance of mud and shadow. He kept the pack at a measured throttle, engines muffled to a predatory purr, headlights off to blend with the moon-dappled pines. Ahead, the sedan's taillights bobbed like distant fireflies, erratic but purposeful, weaving toward the mill's upper access road, a forgotten vein of gravel that snaked into the hills where old logging camps rotted under ivy. Jax's grip tightened on the handlebars, the leather gloves creaking in rhythm with his pulse, each breath fogging the chill before him. The question from Crow echoed again, not as a stranger's plea now, but as a mirror to his own fractured reflection. Dangerous, a word that had defined him since the discharge papers stamped unfit, since his ex's final glare across the courtroom, kids in tow. Mick rode flank, his bulk a steady presence in the rear view, eyes locked on the path like a sentinel who'd stared down worse than shadows in Nam. Lena shadowed Jax's left, her Softail humming low, her face set in that quiet ferocity born of survival, nights evading her ex's truck in rear-view mirrors much like this. Rico and Ben brought up the rear, Tate's limp forcing him to nurse the pace, but no one complained. The brotherhood moved as one, a living chain forged in silences deeper than the storm's rumble. They'd chosen this, eyes on the unknown, not out of thrill, but the gnawing moral itch that silence would only fester. If Crow was prey in his polished cage, turning away felt like abandoning the roadside strays they'd pulled from ditches time and again. The hitchhiker with frostbite, the waitress fleeing a shift gone sour. The sedan slowed at a fork, brake lights flaring red against the wet bark, casting bloody hues on the undergrowth. Jax signaled halt with a low whistle, the pack easing to a stop behind a cluster of boulders, engines dying to whispers. The air hung thick with pine sap and exhaust, the distant mill's hum a faint dirge underscoring the tension. Jax dismounted first, boots sinking into the soft earth, and crept forward, heart thudding a somber beat. The sedan idled there, doors sealed, but a faint glow leaked from the driver's window, perhaps a phone screen, or the ember of a cigarette. No plates visible in the dark, just the sleek anonymity that screamed intent. Jax's hand hovered near his belt, not for a weapon, but the multi-tool that had pried open more than engines, locks, jammed doors, the barriers between life and loss. A muffled voice drifted on the wind, clipped and urgent, too low to parse but laced with frustration. Jax froze, a chill unrelated to the night prickling his skin. He glanced back. Lena nodded, slipping into the brush like a ghost, her steps silent from years of navigating unseen threats. Mick covered her, his breath steady, knuckles scarred from fists thrown in defense, not offense. This wasn't about confrontation, not yet, but the pull of compassion dragged them closer, the same force that had mended the single mom's carburetor last winter. No charge, just a nod of understanding when her eyes welled with unshed gratitude. Crow, with his empires and tremors, felt like an extension of that. A man cracked open on the highway, asking for judgment from those the world deemed unfit to give it. Lightning flickered distant, illuminating the sedan's occupant in a stark flash. A man in a dark jacket, lean frame hunched over the wheel, gesturing sharply into the phone. Not Crow. This one had a sharper jaw, hair cropped military short, movements efficient, almost mechanical. Jax's mind raced, piecing fragments. Corporate enforcer? Private security gone rogue? The briefcase from the breakdown resurfaced in his thoughts, its polished surface hiding what? Stolen data? A confession? Or the fragile remnants of a life unraveling under boardroom knives? He'd seen it in vets at the VA, eyes hollow from betrayals that cut deeper than shrapnel. Buddies sold out for promotions, families fractured by the grind. Dangerous? The real peril wasn't the bike or the suit. It was the isolation that followed, the slow erosion until a man asked strangers for absolution. Lena signaled from the tree line, 2 fingers, clear, but moving. The call ended. The sedan lurched forward, tires spitting gravel as it veered left toward the mill's perimeter fence, a chain-link barrier sagging under years of neglect, crowned with rusted barbed wire that whispered of forgotten boundaries. Jax waved the pack forward, remounting in fluid motion, the engine's revival a low growl that blended with the wind. They tailed at distance, the trail narrowing to a rutted path where branches clawed at their sleeves like insistent doubts. Jax's knee ached with each bump, a dull throb sinking with the moral churn in his gut. Turning back now would preserve their world, the garage's safe hum, the road's endless freedom. But it would leave Crow's question unanswered, a ghost riding shotgun. Compassion, he'd learned from the riders, wasn't a choice. It was the quiet rebellion against the judgments that bound them all. The sedan halted again at the fence line, headlights sweeping the darkness like a searchlight questing for hidden truths. The driver emerged, flashlight beam cutting the night, probing the underbrush near a sagging gate. Jax killed his bike 100 yards back, the pack fanning out on foot now, shadows among shadows. The beam danced erratically, searching for tracks. A breach? The man's posture tensed, head snapping toward the woods as if sensing the unseen eyes. Jax held his breath, a bead of sweat tracing his temple despite the cold, his hand clenching the tool in his pocket. No charge, no fury, just the weight of potential. The Brotherhood's code humming in his veins. Protect the overlooked, even if it meant stepping into the light. Then, a low creak, the gate yielding under the man's push, the chain rattling like loose chains of regret. He slipped through, vanishing into the mill's shadowed yard, the flashlight's glow bobbing toward a cluster of derelict sheds. Jax motioned halt, the pack frozen in the undergrowth, breath synchronized in the hush. What lay beyond? Crow's trail, or a trap sprung from corporate shadows? The revelation stirred in Jax's chest, not fear, but a deepening resolve, the isolation of his scars giving way to the warmth of shared purpose. He'd been the judged one too long. Now, in the quiet justice of the night, he chose to see beyond the leather, to the man who dared ask if danger defined him. Thunder muttered approval as the pack waited, the rain resuming in a fine mist that beaded on their vests like unshed tears. The moral arc bent tighter, compassion's flame flickering against the encroaching dark, pulling Jax toward a confrontation that would redefine not just the road ahead, but the man he'd become. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of Elias Crow reach more people who still believe in humanity. The mist clung to the pines like a shroud, muting the world into shades of gray and green as Jax crouched in the underbrush, the damp earth soaking through his jeans. The mill's yard loomed ahead, a skeletal sprawl of rusted silos and crumbling sheds. relics of a logging boom long faded into whispers of better days. The air carried the metallic tang of old iron and decaying wood, undercut by the faint, acrid bite of something chemical, perhaps runoff from the ridge streams, or the ghost of whatever secrets the night was unearthing. Jax's breath came shallow, each inhale a measured pull against the chill that seeped into his bones, his knee protesting with a sharp twinge as he shifted weight. The pack held formation behind him, Mick's silhouette broad and unyielding against the faint moonlight, Lena's eyes glinting like polished steel, the others diffused into the foliage like echoes of resolve. The intruder's flashlight beam sliced through the dark, erratic now, probing the shadows of the nearest shed, a sagging structure with boards warped from years of neglect, its door hanging ajar like a hesitant confession. The man moved with purpose, his steps crunching softly on the gravel, pausing to scan the perimeter before slipping inside. The beam vanished, swallowed by the gloom, leaving only the low murmur of voices. Two now, indistinct but urgent, laced with the tension of a deal teetering on the edge. Jax's hand tightened around the multi-tool in his pocket, the cool metal a grounding weight, not for harm, but for the small fixes that bridged gaps. A jammed lock, a severed wire, the fragile barrier between threat and salvation. He'd used it before, prying open a crashed truck's door to pull a family from twisted metal while sirens wailed too late. Compassion, he'd learned, was forged in those moments, raw and unpolished. A signal from Lena. 2 fingers, then a fist. 2 inside, no visible backup. She crept forward, silent as the mist, her flannel blending with the night. Jax followed, the pack advancing in a loose arc, boots testing each step to avoid the betraying snap of twigs. The moral churn in his gut deepened, a slow burn that blurred the line between guardian and fool. Why this? Crow was no roadside stray, no trembling waitress or hollow-eyed vet. He was power incarnate, the kind that crushed lives under the weight of stock tickers and NDAs. Yet that question lingered. Do you think I'm dangerous? A crack in the man's armor that mirrored Jax's own fractures. The war had left him questioning his edges, the leather vest a shield against eyes that saw only the threat, not the father who'd once braided his daughter's hair, or the brother who'd held Mick through night terrors. Isolation had been safe, a solitary highway where judgments couldn't touch. But here, in the mill's forgotten heart, compassion pulled like gravity, urging him toward the light. They reached the shed's flank, pressing against the splintered wall, the wood rough and cool under Jax's palm, voices sharpened inside. The files are clean, but he knows. Crow's not stupid. He'll bolt if we don't. A pause, the scrape of boots on concrete. Jax's pulse thrummed in his ears, syncing with the distant drip of water from the eaves. Mick edged closer, his breath a warm puff against Jax's shoulder, eyes questioning in the dimness. No words needed. The riders communicated in glances, forged from rides where engines drowned out doubt. Lena peered through a knothole, her face paling slightly, then nodding. Proceed. Jax's hand trembled, not from fear, but the weight of the choice. Step in, and they risked the world's gaze turning on them, the whispers of vigilantes solidifying into cuffs and headlines. Walk away, and Crow's unraveling became another statistic, another soul judged and discarded. The Brotherhood's code whispered louder. No one hurts those we protect, even if they didn't ask. With a subtle push, Jax eased the door wider, the hinges groaning like a withheld sob. Moonlight spilled in, fracturing the interior. Dust motes swirling, crates stacked like forgotten altars, and 2 figures frozen mid-gesture. The intruder from the sedan whirled, his lean frame tensing, hand diving toward his jacket. Instinct, not malice, but the glint of metal flashed in the low light. The second man, broader, stepped back, face obscured by shadow, but his posture screamed familiarity. the slump of exhaustion, the subtle hitch in his breath. Jax raised empty hands, voice low and steady, gravel worn smooth by years of diffusing storms. "Easy, we're not here for trouble." The lean man halted, eyes narrowing in the gloom, assessing the leather vests, the scarred hands, the quiet circle of the pack filling the doorway. No charge, no shouts, just presence, a wall of unyielding calm. Mick flanked left, Lena right, the others holding the threshold like sentinels. The air thickened, charged with the scent of sweat and tension, the intruder's breath ragged now. "Who the hell are you?" he snarled, accent clipped, East Coast sharp. But his hand eased from the jacket, the metal vanishing, perhaps a badge, or something deadlier, implications hanging like smoke. Before Jax could answer, the broader figure stepped into the light, and the world tilted. Elias Crow, silver temples damp with mist, coat rumpled, briefcase clutched like a talisman. His eyes met Jax's, widening not in surprise but recognition. A flicker of something raw and unguarded passing between them. "You," Crow breathed, voice cracking on the edge of relief and dread. The tremor in his hands was visible now, the polished facade splintering under the weight of exposure. Jax's chest tightened, the pieces slotting into place. The breakdown? No accident? The question a desperate gauge of trust. Crow wasn't the hunter. He was the hunted, cornered by shadows of his own making. Betrayals in boardrooms, perhaps a whistleblower's burden, or the ghosts of deals that had cost more than fortunes. The lean man glanced between them, confusion etching his features. "You know these riders?" Crow nodded faintly, his gaze locked on Jax, as if seeing the man beneath the vest for the first time. The veteran, the father, the quiet force who'd fixed more than an engine on that rainy highway. "They're the ones who helped me," Crow said, the words heavy with implication. A bridge extended across chasms of class and judgment. Jax felt the shift within, isolation yielding to connection, the moral arc bending toward revelation. Dangerous? Not the bikes or the suits, but the unshared burdens that isolated souls until kindness cracked them open. Tension held, fragile as the mist outside, the pack's silence a shield of loyalty. Crow straightened slightly, the tremor easing, his voice gaining steel. "He's with me, security. But there's more. People who want what I have, and they'll burn everything to get it." The lean man relaxed fractionally, holstering whatever lay hidden, but his eyes remained wary, scanning the riders like potential allies or threats. Jax stepped forward, the floorboards creaking under his boot, a small gesture that bridged the gap. "We ride for what's right," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of his evolution. From guarded loner to reluctant redeemer. The shed seemed smaller now, the shadows retreating as humanity asserted itself, compassion threading through the brutality of the night. Outside, the rain whispered to a halt, the first stars piercing the clouds like hesitant hopes. The confrontation hung suspended, a moral precipice where choices would redefine them all, loyalty's hum rising above the silence of judgment. Jax met Crow's gaze again, the question answered not in words, but in the stand they now shared. The shed's air thickened with the scent of damp wood and rust, the faint chemical tang sharpening as Jax held Crow's gaze, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down like the low ceiling above. Moonlight filtered through cracks in the walls, casting elongated shadows that twisted across the crates like fingers reaching for confession. Jax's boot shifted on the creaking floorboards, the sound echoing in the suspended quiet, his knee sending a fresh stab of protest up his leg, a reminder of battles where hesitation cost lives. But here, in this forgotten corner of the mill, hesitation felt like the only sane choice. Yet compassion anchored him, pulling against the isolation that had once defined every mile of his road. Crow set the briefcase on a dusty crate with deliberate care, the latch clicking open like a reluctant sigh. Inside, papers gleamed under the dim light. Contracts, ledgers, a flash drive that caught the glow like a hidden ember. His hands, no longer trembling, steadied as he met the lean man's eyes first, then Jax's. "It's not just business," Crow said, voice low and frayed at the edges, the East Coast polish cracking to reveal the raw underbelly of a man who'd built walls higher than any highway overpass. "I was going to blow it open. The buyout. It's a front. My partners. They're laundering through the mill, cutting corners that poison the rivers, displace families like yours." He gestured vaguely toward the riders, the words tumbling out in a rush, as if the dam had finally breached. I couldn't stay silent, not anymore. But they found out. That breakdown? I staged it to lose the tail, buy time. Your question. No, your silence. It made me see I wasn't alone in this. The lean man, Marcus as Crow introduced him, nodded curtly, his military crop casting sharp shadows across a face etched with the discipline of private contracts gone sideways. "I've been with him 3 months," Marcus said, voice clipped, but softening at the edges. His hand resting openly now, no threat in the gesture. "Thought I was just guarding assets. Turns out it's guarding a conscience." He glanced at the pack, the wariness in his stance easing into something like respect, the kind earned in foxholes or back alley stands, not boardrooms. Jax felt the air shift, the tension uncoiling not with violence, but the subtle release of shared burden. Mick grunted approval from the doorway, his scarred knuckles flexing as he scanned the perimeter, ever the sentinel. Lena stepped closer, her presence a quiet force, eyes flicking to the briefcase with the empathy of someone who'd hidden her own scars behind a tough exterior. Jax's chest tightened, the late revelation hitting like rain on parched earth. Crow wasn't the predator the headlines painted, a ruthless CEO devouring small towns for profit. He was a father, too, Jax realized, catching the glint of a photo tucked among the papers. A young woman, mid-20s, smiling at a graduation, her features echoing Crow's silvered resolve. "My daughter," Crow murmured, following Jax's gaze, his voice catching on the word. "She's Y, works for a nonprofit, fighting the kind of messes I helped create. If this breaks wrong, it takes her down too." The confession hung there, raw and human, stripping away the suit to reveal a man in mourning, for the life he'd compromised, the family he'd distanced to protect them from his shadows. Jack saw his own reflection, the daughters he'd lost to judgments of danger, the war's ghosts that isolated him until the writer's loyalty bridged the gap. Dangerous? It was the silence around such truths that poisoned deepest. The pack absorbed it in nods and low murmurs. Rico leaning against the wall with a soft exhale, Ben's wide eyes narrowing into understanding. Tate rubbed his knee absently, the shared pain of hidden wounds binding them tighter. "We know about carrying what others can't see," Jack said finally, his voice gravel-worn but steady, stepping forward to close the distance. He extended a hand, not in aggression, but alliance. The calluses of wrenchwork, meeting the softer grip of a man who'd gripped steering wheels through moral storms. Crow's clasp was firm, a tremor lingering but fading. The contact a small act of kindness that rippled outward, awakening the Brotherhood's code anew. No one hurts those we protect. It wasn't about the money or the power. It was the quiet stand, the compassion that defied the world's blind judgments. Outside, the mist lifted, stars emerging like hesitant witnesses as the group moved into the yard. Marcus secured the briefcase, his movements efficient, while Crow outlined the next steps, handing the evidence to a contact in the next town, a rideshare under the cover of the rider's formation. No grand plans, just the practical hum of survival. Engines ready, routes mapped on the fly. The confrontation resolved not in fury, but contained resolve, the sedan abandoned, its secrets left to rust, as the pack formed a protective ring around the Mercedes waiting at the fence line. Jax mounted his Harley last, the engine's rumble vibrating through him like a heartbeat renewed, the isolation of his scars giving way to the warmth of redemption. He'd evolved here, from the guarded rider who'd fixed an engine in the rain, to the man who fixed a fracture in the night, proving that strength lay in the unseen loyalties. They rolled out together, the highway unfolding under dawn's first blush, engines humming in unison, a symphony of quiet justice. Crow rode in the Mercedes, Marcus at the wheel, the riders flanking like shadows turned guardians. Willow Creek slept on, oblivious to the moral arc bent and mended in the dark. As the miles blurred, Jax glanced at the side mirror, seeing not just the pack, but a fragile new bond. Outcasts united against the silence that isolated them all. Compassion had triumphed, not with fanfare, but the steady thrum of loyalty, redefining what family truly meant. Beyond blood, beyond leather or ledgers, in the courage to ask and answer the hardest questions. In the rear view, the mill faded into mist, a reminder that redemption whispers loudest in the spaces where judgments fail. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, justice, and redemption. Thank you for watching The Case of Elias Crow. See you in the next one.